Think of a time when you had to give medicine to a little child, and the mixture was bitter, wretched tasting. And of course, the child would hesitate, even shrink from taking it. But finally, with your coaxing, cajoling, he drinks it. So also Christ shrank from the cross, yet accepted it in humble obedience to the Father's will. I think sometimes we're so accustomed to the story of Christ's suffering and death that we forget that as he approached that time, he did shrink from carrying out that dreadful task. He sought another way. And so, as he prayed in Gethsemane, which means oil press, he may have felt he was in such a press. But why did he seek to escape from this sacrifice? I'd like us to consider today those things which would lead Jesus to shrink from the cross and do as Matthew records in chapter 26, verse 39. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." And the first thing to consider is his physical pain. As Jesus approached that fateful hour, he knew how terrible would be the physical suffering. No doubt everyone in Palestine was familiar with the dreaded Roman crucifixion. Consider with me what Jesus knew was to come if he followed the path that had been laid out for him. First, there would be the flogging with a leather lash, which usually had bits of stone or glass tied into its leather thongs, and beginning with bruising and tearing until the body would be bleeding, skin torn, and in some cases shredded. Sometimes convicts died at the flogging, though usually the Romans wanted to prevent that so as to prolong the suffering. Then, after that terrible beating, there would be the exhausting trek out of the city and up to the hill of execution, Golgotha, place of the skull. He would be carrying the cross member of his cross all the way up there. Then he would be thrown to the ground, his hands nailed to the cross. Nails would pierce not his palms, but his wrists, going between the bones of the wrist and into the main nerve, causing unbelievable pain. The feet would be overlapped, knees somewhat bent, forced onto a small pedestal, usually, and nailed there. This would allow the victim to push himself up. Then, as the cross was lifted up and dropped into the hole, the victim would be disoriented, but even worse, the sudden jolt of it dropping into the hole would pull at his shoulders and elbows, sometimes causing separations and dislocations. But that was only the beginning. The position of the arms caused the chest to be constricted so that the victim could not breathe except by pulling or pushing himself up. That would relieve the pressure and allow breaths. However, the pain would be so intense that one could only hold that position briefly. And this would be repeated minute upon minute, hour upon hour, until the victim no longer had the strength and then would die of asphyxiation. On average, we're told it took often 2 to 3 days to die. Knowing this was ahead, who would not shrink from that death? And so Jesus, who always obeyed the Father, looked for another way. "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then secondly, his lonely shame. Jesus never made a step toward the cross without finding himself going alone. Oh, sure, Peter proclaim boldly he would go to the death for Jesus. But on that betrayal night, where was Peter? But in the courtyard of the high priest, categorically denying any acquaintance with Jesus. I don't know the man, Peter said. And the other disciples also left him alone, fleeing in fear of their own lives. Jesus stood alone that long night of trial in the high priest's house as they assembled a kangaroo court to try him. Then on that Friday morning, he stood alone before Pilate, and then Herod, and then Pilate again. And after being condemned, he trudged alone along the Via Dolorosa. Then, as the songwriter says, he died alone for you and me. This loneliness was also one of shame, and Jesus shrank from it as all humans shrink from it, since the cross was also a place of humiliation. John records this. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. The garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said one to another. Let's decide by lot who will get it. In the first century, the normal attire for Jewish men included 5 pieces of clothing. Well, the soldiers had split 4 pieces among them and had gambled to see who would get the 5th, fulfilling the words of Psalm 22. What this means is that Jesus had been stripped naked. Every vestige of human dignity had been taken away, his bruised and torn body displayed for everyone to see. It's the way the Romans did it. The psalmist predicted this centuries before. I can count all my bones. People stare and gloat over me, the psalmist wrote. That phrase, count all my bones, makes it clear that Jesus was exposed for all to see. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, as Jesus agonized in prayer and his disciples fell asleep, Jesus could see the loneliness and shame that would be part of the cup that he was given to drink, and it was a horrifying prospect. So Jesus shrank from the loneliness and shame as he prayed, Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. And then there was his mental anguish. Physical suffering, loneliness, and shame were not the only things that caused Jesus to pray for another way. The mental and emotional torment was more than we can imagine. Think of when you're facing a difficult or challenging situation, how stressful that can be. Or when you're waiting for news about a loved one and you have no certainty as to whether they're safe. Such is the mental anguish that one cannot sleep, and it is hard to function in a normal way. Now consider Jesus' situation. He knew this was his last night. He had told his disciples, I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now until the day when I drink it anew in my Father's kingdom. No longer would he share laughter with his disciples. No longer would he be there to answer their questions, listen to their petty arguments, or travel with them from place to place. No longer would he have the joy of seeing them grow in their knowledge and understanding of the kingdom of God. And what's more, he knew Peter, for all his bravado, would deny even knowing him. He knew that Judas, even as he prayed, was putting into an action this terrible scheme to betray him into the hands of his enemies. He knew the rest of the disciples would abandon him, running away in fear. All these things Jesus knew with clarity. So imagine the mental and emotional strain that knowledge and those thoughts would bring. How would we feel and react if we found that all our friends and family had forsaken us and left us by ourselves to face the greatest crisis of our lives? I don't know about you, but I think I'd be looking for a way out. And Jesus looked for an alternative. He prayed to the Father, asking if there was another way to achieve the same objective. So he shrank from the cross, from its physical horror and suffering, from its loneliness and shame, and the mental and emotional anguish he was already enduring, and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." And then there was his despair of soul. You see, there was another element to his suffering that went far deeper than physical torture or mental torment or sorrow of heart, and that is his despair of the soul. As Reverend W.M. Clow states, the step God called upon him to take seemed to separate him from God. Was it his Father's will that he should go out from his presence and find it night? Consider the times when you have felt that God is no longer near, no longer listening, no longer loving. If you have ever felt despair of the soul, hasn't it been times when we are acutely aware of our sin? Our sin is clearly before us, and we wonder how God could ever love us. We are like the prodigal who is reluctant to leave the pigsty because he is so ashamed that of what he has done, and he has brought such shame to his father and his family. That's despair of the soul. But in a pure and sinless heart, such as that of Jesus Christ, such despair of the soul does not come from his own sin, but from the sin of others. Jesus had completely identified with us. He had been born of a woman, growing up in the normal human way. He had been tempted in every way like we are, but he hadn't sinned. He lived among us, experiencing life as we do, with its joys and sorrows, achievements and disappointments. Now he knew that the hour had come for him to do what he had been born to do. He knew the cross was not so much about the physical, mental, and emotional suffering, as real as that was, but about him taking upon himself the sin of the whole world. He knew that on the cross, God would make him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus knew that in becoming sin for us, he would be separated from the Father, who is absolutely pure and holy. He knew that he would become accursed. Consider how terrible that would be. Think about how unimaginably horrifying that would be to a person who during his ministry stated, "I and the Father are one." There had been complete unity between them. To know Jesus was to know the Father. And suddenly Jesus was asked to give that up, to be cut off from the Father in order to give a chance to a reluctant, recalcitrant, rebellious creation. Is it any wonder Jesus prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will"? I think sometimes we think that Jesus came to earth and breezed through life without a struggle and died on the cross like some Hollywood star with some macho physical power that sees the hero beat nearly senseless only to summon some inner strength to win the day. But that's not how it happened with Jesus. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus faced the greatest battle of his life. In fact, Luke records his anguish was so great that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, this is actually a known but rare occurrence. The clinical word for it is hematidrosis. It can happen when the blood vessels around the sweat glands constrict due to extreme stress and then dilate to the point of rupture, and blood is released through the body or from the body through the sweat glands. So great was the battle with physical pain and the lonely shame, and the mental anguish and the despair of the soul, that an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. But Jesus' prayer did not stop with, "Take this cup from me." His prayer finished with these inspiring words, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." With those words on his lips and that decision in his heart and soul, Jesus left the garden in strength and calmness of soul. From that moment on, Jesus was at peace and in control. Only at that fateful time came on the cross when he took upon his shoulders the sin of the whole world, yours and mine. Only at that time do we ever see such agony of the entire person. We see it when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And at that moment, he seemed to be suffering everything he knew he would when he was in the garden. What does it mean that Christ shrank from the cross? Well, for me, it says, one, that my sin must be incredibly offensive and horrible to God, and therefore I should not take it lightly. I should never think it doesn't matter, because God will forgive me anyway. It reminds me that such an attitude is callous and ungrateful. And secondly, it reminds me that God's love is incredibly amazing. You know, a parent might sacrifice a lot for a child. A lover might give his life or her life for their beloved. But who would ever sacrifice themselves for their enemy, for the one who caused their suffering? It makes the words of 1 John 3:16 all the more amazing. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, didst die for me?